So this first video is going to walk us through talking about different types of variables. We're going to be dealing with qualitative or categorical variables, quantitative, ordinal, and intervals, 4 total types. It's easiest to go ahead and start with categorical, so let's start there. Easiest way to understand this is to think categories. So when we talk about categorical variables, we're talking about categories or qualities, which is why it's called a qualitative or categorical variable. Now, categorical variables can be kind of misleading, and we'll talk about that in a second, but let's look at a couple examples first. Examples of categorical variables include things like hair color. That is, when we look at hair color, you can be a brunette, you can be a blonde, you can have black hair, but there are distinct categories that we can fit people into. Other examples of categorical variables would be, let's say, school status. For instance, you can say undergraduate versus graduate, or freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. Those are distinct categories we can fit into. I said can be a little bit misleading, and the reason for that is things like zip code are also categorical. That is, for instance, I live in 21211. That's the category I fit into, or my area of residence. This is not a number in the way that we can add it or subtract it or average it. Rather, it's a distinct category. So that's categorical variables. Our second type of variable we're going to go ahead and look at is quantitative. Quantitative variables are variables that involve a quantity. This is distinct from categorical in that when we look at a quantity, we are able to operate on it. That is, we can add it, we can subtract it, we can average it. And so these are very numeric. Examples of these can be things like height, age, or maybe even weight. So they're numbers that we get out of here. Now, when we look at categorical and quantitative variables, quantitative can actually be broken down into 2 separate types of quantitative variables, and we'll go ahead and look at that in a second. In the meantime, though, let's go ahead and talk about ordinal and interval variables. So, we have categorical, that is a category you fit into, quantitative, that is a quantity or a number that you're giving me out here, ordinal variables, can be ordered. So we're always looking for root words here. So ordinal can be ordered. Examples of ordinal variables could be opinion questions. That is, I could ask you, how much do you like Cheetos? And you could say, not at all, somewhat, like them, love them, etc. That is, I can order these. Not at all is less than somewhat, which is less than like, which is less than love, and so forth. That is, despite the fact that they're not numbers, there's still an order to them. This is seen a lot in opinion, or let's say political ratings. Our final type of variable is interval. And I'm imagining you can guess an interval variable involves intervals. Now, when we look at interval variables, I want to be very clear here that they're going to involve numbers, but the difference is you're not giving me an exact number, you're selecting what interval you fit into. So, for instance, income is a really good example of a variable that's an interval variable. So, for instance, I could ask you, do you make between 0 and 20K a year, between 20K and 40K a year, between 40 and 60K a year, etc. That is, although you're giving me a numeric response, you're selecting an interval. You're not giving me an actual value out. So to review this, we have 4 different types of variables. We have ordinal, that is a response that can be ordered, or interval, that is selecting which interval you fall into. Now I want to be very clear that some variables can go ahead and fit into multiple categories like this. For instance, we talked a second ago about age. Now when I ask you your age, if you're going to go ahead and give me your exact age, we're going to be dealing with a quantitative variable. That is, you're giving me back a quantity. Now, you don't have to give me back a quantity, though. For instance, you could go ahead and say, well, I'm a teenager. Or I'm middle-aged. In this way, this becomes categorical, in that you're giving me a category. It's also ordinal, in that it can be ordered. In exactly the way that this is categorical and yet ordinal too, it can be ordered, we can also take quantitative and make it into an interval. For instance, I could ask you, are you between 0 and 10? Or are you between 10 and 18? Or 18 and 29? And so forth. Thus, I can take this and I can give you intervals to select instead. So that is, one single variable, age, can warrant different types of response depending on how I ask the question. Here, exact quantitative. Giving you categories to choose from, categorical. If those categories can be ordered, like teenager, middle age, etc., it becomes ordinal as well as categorical. Or if I want to take that quantitative variable and go ahead and give you intervals, like 0 to 10, 10 to 18, 18 to 29, making it less specific, I can go ahead and make this an interval variable. So this video is going to walk us through the different types of quantitative variables. Now, it's important to remember quantitative, quantity, we're just talking about a number here, but it turns out there are two really different types of numbers. So to begin here, let's say we have all quantitative variables. Turns out we can divide those up into two different types, one which we'll call discrete and one which we'll call continuous. We're going to start here by going ahead and talking about discrete quantitative variables. Discrete basically means we have a finite number of possible outcomes. That is, there are only finitely many things you can choose from when you give me your response. An example of a discrete variable is something like kids, specifically the number of kids you have. So if I ask you how many kids you have, you could say 0, you could say 1, you could say 2, you might even say 121. But you can't say something like 1/2. That's not a possibility. And you can't say things like 0.1, 0, 2, 3 kids. Not a possibility as well. That is, while you could tell me 0 or you could tell me 1, you can't choose any possible number in between. That is, there are only finitely many options of responses you could give me. Now, kids is a good example. So is shoe size. That is, if I ask you what shoe size you are, you could tell me you're a 10. You could tell me you're an 11. You could even tell me you're a 10.5. The problem, though, is you can't tell me you're like 10.013. That doesn't make any sense. That is not an option. So once again, 10, 10.5, 11, you can't choose anything in between there. There are only finitely many options that you could choose from. Now, this could be compared to continuous variables. So with a continuous variable, you can choose any option from an interval of choices. Now, specifically what this is telling us here is that you're not limited to just a couple different options. So for instance, let's talk about weight. Now, if I ask you what weight you are, you might say I'm 171 pounds. You could be a little more exact. You could say I'm 171.5 pounds. Or maybe you just happen to have stepped onto an industrial scale and you know that you're actually 171.5, 1, 2, 3, 6, 7. You can have really, really good accuracy with that, and that's entirely legitimate. That is, you probably don't weigh exactly 171 or 171.5. There's probably a whole bunch of different decimals after it. You could, in fact, choose any number in between here. That is, we have infinitely many possible choices because you could keep going down and down and down on the decimal. Now, sometimes it's hard to tell between discrete, where we have finitely many options, and continuous, where we have infinitely many options. So let's go ahead and look at an example here. Let's go ahead and start by talking about a really good one. Let's talk about age. Now, if I ask you your age, that's definitely a quantitative variable, so we know that, which is good. So the only question is it discrete or continuous? So, for instance, if I ask you how old you are, you might tell me you're 19. Are you exactly 19 years old, though? I mean, probably not. You're probably something like 19 years, maybe 6 months. If you want to be accurate about it, maybe 15 days. And if someone had been there at your birth and started a stopwatch at that exact second, then you could tell me you're also 3 hours, 2 minutes, 5.13267 seconds. That is, while when I ask you your age, you treat it like it's discrete. You give me just a single number. We could get that accuracy if we really wanted to. And that's what the difference is. This is continuous, because it's possible for me to measure it that accurate. Even if I give you the response, it doesn't betray that level of accuracy. So, when we talk about this, continuous, if I could measure it that much more accurately. Discrete, if there are only finitely many options for us to choose from.